We're going to continue our study in the book of Ruth, and you should have outline number 8. Ruth 4, 1 through 12. Boaz makes a deal to claim his bride. And it's outline number 8. Now we're going to finish Ruth next Wednesday night. Next Wednesday night will be our last night in Ruth, and we're going to begin another book of the Bible following that. Ruth 4, 1 through 12. We'll review for a little bit. We were out of Ruth for a few weeks with some of the events that we had take place. I was gone for my son's wedding, and then last week we had all of our guests with us from the hurricane experience, and I felt like we needed to preach a salvation message for them. And so we've been gone for several weeks. Let's see what you remember from our last time in the book of Ruth in our review. Name the ancient Hebrew custom concerning widows, which is the basis for the book of Ruth. What's that? The kinsman redeemer. That's right. Remember, it's the idea that the widow, her husband died, and it became the brother's responsibility to then marry the widow and to care for her needs and to take care of his deceased brother's property. Number 2, at what place did Ruth go to meet Boaz with her request for marriage? Went to the threshing floor. Remember, she went to see him while he was asleep at the threshing floor. And number 3, did Ruth wear her working clothes to go meet Boaz? No. What did she do? She dressed up. Remember what her mother-in-law Naomi told her? Wash and anoint yourself and put on perfume. She put her war paint on. She went to see him. Number 4, did Boaz immediately accept Ruth's proposal of marriage? No. Remember, he stated, he said, there is another kinsman that is closer than me. And he said, I've got to get that worked out with him before I can accept your proposal to be the kinsman redeemer. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about the other kinsman redeemer. And then number 5, true or false? Naomi told Ruth that Boaz would forget about her. False. Remember, Naomi said, he's not going to rest until he gets this thing worked out. He's going to get it taken care of. I got one more. True or false? The pastor was glad to get through Ruth chapter 3. That's true. I'm not going to repeat that. If you want it, you'll have to get the tape. All right. Introduction. Several things about the passage from tonight. You need to remember that Boaz cannot claim Ruth as his bride until he has settled with a kinsman redeemer that is closer than him. Now remember, we are not exactly sure who Boaz, what his relationship is to Elimelech, the deceased father-in-law of Ruth and the father of Naomi. We're not exactly sure what his relationship is, but we know that he is some kind of a blood relative. We do know that there is another kinsman that is in the city of Bethlehem that is somehow closer to Elimelech. And Ruth, for whatever reason, has not chosen him to be the kinsman redeemer. And we could talk all night long as to why her choice was Boaz instead of him. It could be that Boaz was a younger man. It could be that maybe Naomi, it seems to me that Naomi is very much involved in what's going on in the life of Ruth at this point. Maybe Naomi thought Boaz would be a better husband to her. We're not really certain. I think that the best way to look at it is that God in his providence chose Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer. And so there is another individual, though, that Boaz is going to have to deal with. Number 2, the events of chapter 4 should be viewed as taking place on the day after Ruth's marriage proposal. Now look back, if you would, in chapter 3 in verse 14. You remember the story how Ruth came to Boaz at night and she presented herself as a wedding prospect. And in verse 14 it says, I'm sorry, it's not verse 14. Yes, let's see. And she lay at his feet until the morning. And she rose up before one could know another, and he said, let it not be known that a woman came into the floor. I'll look back up in verse 13. That's what I'm looking for. It says, tarry this night. This is Boaz's words to Ruth. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning, that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman well, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then I will do the part of a kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth, lie down until the morning. And so he's made a pledge to her. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to take care of this. He's not going to let it go by. And so you need to understand that chapter 4 is the very next day. He doesn't let any grass grow under his feet at all with this. He wants to marry Ruth. But then Naomi makes the same statement. Look, if you would, in verse 18 of chapter 3. She says, sit still, my daughter. until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man will not be in rest until he finish the thing this day. So mother-in-law says, honey, you don't need to fret on this. I have looked at the way that Boaz looks at you, and he's in love, and he's not going to let the day go by until he gets this thing accomplished. He's going to take care of this near kinsman. Now, the third thing that I want you to see is very important. Look, if you would, in verse 1 of chapter 4. Then went Boaz up to the gate. Now, there's a very unusual play on Hebrew words in 4:1, and with that play on words, the attention is focused on Boaz. And here's what the play is. In Hebrew, in English, we always put the noun first and then the verb. Fred preached at the church. That's how we order our sentences. Well, in Hebrew, this is how you would say it. Preached Fred at the church. And the verb always comes before the noun. In Greek, you can have all kinds of sentences and never have a verb in it. But in Hebrew, you always have a verb, and the verb always comes before the noun. And so it would be like that. Preached Fred at the church. That's just how they spoke. That's how they did it. And whenever you look at all those places in the Bible, you can look at almost any sentence. Let me give you one as an example. Look, if you would, up in verse 14 of chapter 3. If you read that literally from the Hebrew, in English it says, and she lay at his feet until the morning. In Hebrew, it would be, lay at his feet until the morning she. And she would be down toward the end. That's just the way the Hebrew people spoke. But if you look in chapter 4 in verse 1, in Hebrew, it says literally exactly what it says in English. Then went Boaz to the gate. And, the writer of English has even tried to make a difference in it. What the Hebrew says is, then Boaz went. Boaz is put first in the verse. Now, is that significant? To the Hebrew mindset, it's very significant. Because in the Hebrew mindset, the writer of Ruth would be using bad grammar at this point. He would be trying to emphasize Boaz himself. Now, why is that so important? It's important because in the book of Ruth, Ruth and Naomi have been the real heroes of the story. They've talked about all their ordeal in chapter 1. They've talked about their trip back in chapter 2 and the meeting of Boaz. And in chapter 3, it talks about the marriage proposal. And Ruth has been the major player in the story. But now when you get down to Ruth chapter 4, Ruth is no longer the major player. Now Boaz begins to take center stage. And that is very significant because Boaz is a picture of Jesus. Before the coming together in chapter 4 of the marriage, Ruth didn't have a song, man. She didn't have anything. But now all of a sudden she marries Boaz and she becomes a wealthy lady with a family of her own. Boaz came into her life. He now becomes the hero of the story. So that's very significant. And the Hebrew writer makes that indication by putting the word Boaz as the number one word in chapter 4. Now, you need to understand that there are several things in the passage of Scripture that we're going to look at tonight that are difficult to understand. I don't have to point that out to you. When you read the passage, you'll understand that there are some things that are hard to understand. And then fifthly, in the introduction, the picture of the redemption of Ruth by Boaz is a picture of the difference of grace and law. And it's hard to see that before you actually look at the passage, but I think that you can see it whenever we finish the passage tonight. Now, I divided up these 12 verses into really just 3 sections. The first section is Boaz keeps his promise to Ruth, and that's in verse 1. So let's look at that verse for a moment. Then went Boaz up to the gate and sat him down there. And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, a most unusual phrase. Turn aside, sit down here, and he turned aside and sat down. Now you need to see in this that Boaz went to the gate. He went to the gate to the place of justice. And the gate was probably a court. He was going up to the gate of the city of Bethlehem. This was the place where the legal decisions of the city would be made. And for him to go up is the idea that he's going up to find justice. Anytime in the Old Testament, whenever you're referring to going to Jerusalem to make a sacrifice, it'll always talk about going up to Jerusalem. Whether you went up in elevation or not, it always talks about going up to the temple. Well, whenever you were going to settle a matter of law or go to court, it talked about going up to court. And so Boaz has set his face now to go to the gate, and he's going to go to court to win the hand of Ruth. He wants to take care of this problem of the near kinsman. To sit down is a statement that he came to do business. Now, I think that you need to see that by Boaz being named first in verse 1 of chapter 4, it's a statement that the story's not going to go on if Boaz doesn't act. It's a statement that he's the hero of the story, and it's a statement that Boaz is now going to take charge and take care of the difficulties that Ruth has. Now, Boaz meets the kinsman of Ruth there in verse 1, and I think he says, let's make a deal. It says that, behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by. Remember the night before he told Ruth, I want to marry him, but there's one who's closer in kin to Elimelech than I am, and I'm going to have to deal with him. I think that he probably knew when the kinsman was going to come by. Boaz was blood kin to him, so he would know what his schedule would be like. And he knew that this man was going to go out and work in his field in the day. So he goes and he sits by the gate and he waits for him to come by. I think that it is in the providence of God that just at the time Boaz sat down to say, I have a matter that needs to come before the court or before the elders of the city, just at that time the man is happening to walk by. I think God's in control of the situation. Now, what does he call the kinsman? Look in the text. It says, ho, such a one. Now, that's a most unusual phrase in Hebrew. Some Bibles can translate that, my friend. And he just sees the man come by and he says, hey, my friend, how are you? But I don't think that's a good translation. You could translate it, hey, you, with the idea of coming over there. Hey, you come and see me. I want to talk to you about something. But that's not a good translation either. Here is the best translation from the Hebrew text. It says that he saw him and he said, hey, so-and-so, I want to talk with you. Now, what in the world is meant by that? Here's what I think. I think that he called him by name. We'll just say that the man's name was Mike. Mike's down here. We'll just give him Mike's name. We'll say the man's name was Mike. I think he said, hey, Mike. He knew what his name was. Ruth knew what his name was. The writer of Ruth knew what his name was. Everybody who was there knew what his name was. But the writer of Ruth chose not to include his name in the text. And so he just says, ho, such a one, which in Hebrew means, hey, so-and-so, come over here. Now, why would he not want to include this man's name in the text? Anybody got an idea? What's that? It would deprive Boaz of being the leader in the chapter. That's right. It's possible. But I think there's something else. Whose responsibility was it to be the kinsman redeemer? It was this man's responsibility. He should have already taken care of this, and he hadn't done it. He hadn't done anything. He was the one who was really supposed to do something about it, but he had made no move whatsoever to do it, and he's about to give up his right as the kinsman redeemer, which in some ways would be a little bit of an embarrassment for his family. And so the writer of Ruth just put so-and-so there for his name. Probably not to bring any kind of shame or embarrassment upon his family. So I think that's probably what that phrase literally means. So he speaks to him and he invites him to sit down to address a pressing matter of business. He says, turn aside and sit down here, and he turned aside and he sat down. Now, a lot of times whenever you read phrases like that in the Bible, you get the idea, that it's just a real simple statement of what's going on. Turn aside and sit down here and we're going to talk about it. That's probably not true. This is early in the morning. The man is going out to his field to work, and he's telling him, I don't want you to go out to your field to work right now. I want you to drop everything that you're doing, and I want you to sit down right now and talk to me. Now, that's a pretty big, heavy-duty statement for him to ask a man who is a farmer going out to his field to work. He says, drop what you're doing, and now I want you to come and talk to me. Now, look, if you would, at verse 2. Boaz now moves through a legal proceeding to redeem Ruth. And as I read this passage of Scripture, I make a discovery. Boaz is a shrewd used car salesman. He knows exactly how to go about doing this. Look, if you would, in verse 2. First of all, the court's called to order. It says in verse 2, he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit ye down here, and they sat down. 10 men in Hebrew thought in that day would constitute a quorum to hold a court of law. So that's why he needed 10 men to do this. Now, the fact that Boaz could get 10 men to do this in the morning is a statement of his stature in the community. And he had to be pretty well-to-do in order to call 10 men away from their jobs and work and livelihoods to be able to appear there first thing in the morning in court. How did Boaz go about doing that? Chances are, after Ruth left the threshing floor that morning, he probably got on the Hebrew telephone and said, "You meet me at the city. I need 10 men to hold a law court this morning." And he was significant enough in the city that he got up a crowd of men to do that. Now, what would the court look like? They have excavated portions of Bethlehem, and many archaeologists feel that the court he's talking about here would be a place that they called the Gazer Gate. The Gazer Gate. And outside the gate of the city, what they would do whenever they would hold a court of law like this to decide a matter of justice, you don't need to get the picture that they just all kind of sat out on the, in the dust and in the hot sun. That's not how it worked. Whenever they held courts of law in that day and time, and you got all those elderly men together to discuss things, they argued about everything, and they'd be there for a very long period of time. So they didn't sit out in the hot sun to do it. What they have is exactly what they have excavated around the city of, around the gate of Gazer in Bethlehem. It would be a small walled-in room. It's about 7 by 14 feet, and it would have benches going all the way around the sides of it. And so he's got 10 men. He's got himself and the kinsman redeemer. So there are a dozen men, and they're all crammed in a 7 by 14 room, staring at one another and looking at each other face to face, trying to determine what's going to be the case that we decide on today. And so he's got them there in the court of law, and you need to know that they didn't have a lot of witnesses to what took place. If you were going to be a witness, you would have to stand at the doorway of that little cell area and look in. I think that whoever wrote Ruth, we're not told who the author of Ruth is, whoever wrote Ruth was probably one of those 10 men that sat there in that courtroom on that day. And he knew all the events, and he knew all the story that had happened. I think that would be a good indication of maybe who the writer or the author of Ruth was. So what does Boaz do? In verse 3, Boaz makes a statement. He says he's asking the kinsman to redeem, first of all, land. Now, nobody's mentioned land before in the book of Ruth. So where did this land thing come from? Look in verse 3. Boaz calls attention to the plight of Elimelech's inheritance. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, that is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother's Elimelech's. Now, when you first read the translation of Ruth 4, it gets real confusing. I don't think that you need to see that this is a parcel of land that Naomi is trying to sell. That's not what it means. Naomi is a widow. She can't own land. And since she can't own land, she certainly can't sell land. Well, where did the land come from? There are many theories about this, but let me give you what is probably the most plausible explanation. Elimelech and Naomi had lived in Bethlehem before. And where did Elimelech and Naomi move to? Where did they go off to? Remember? They went to Moab. When they went to Moab, I believe that was wrong. Remember, we talked about that the first night we discussed Ruth. I believe that possibly, or probably, Elimelech owned land in Bethlehem at that time. For whatever reason, when he left to go to Moab, he sold the land. Maybe he sold it to pay off some debts. Maybe he sold it to finance the trip. Maybe he sold it because he was about to starve to death during the famine, and it came to the point now where he didn't have any money left, and that's why they went to Moab. We don't know all the ins and outs of that. But whatever the case is, Elimelech at one time had owned land, and that land had been sold to someone or indebted to someone, and now someone outside their family owned it. Now here is the responsibility of the kinsman redeemer. Look, if you would, right there once again in verse 3. He said to the kinsman, Naomi that's come again out of the country of Moab, sells a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. And in verse 4, and I thought to advertise thee, saying, buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. And so here's what he tells the near kinsman. He says, this land belonged to Elimelech. Elimelech has died. His sons are dead. He has left no heir. And now all that is left is this poor widow Naomi. And she doesn't have land. She doesn't have anything. And so as he first presents it, it is something along these lines. That land at one time belonged to Elimelech. We need to redeem it for him. We need to buy it back so it will be in our family once again. And by buying it back, you will probably take upon yourself the responsibility of taking care of this widow, Naomi, and use that land in order to take care of her needs and in order to help her in her old age, in order to give her a pension of some kind. And I like the way that he describes talking to him. Do you see what it says in verse 4? I thought to advertise to thee saying. That's the only time the word advertise is used in the King James Version. But the word advertise here, it doesn't mean the same thing that we think of in advertise. In Hebrew, it literally means, I'm going to pull the rags away from your ear, and I'm going to talk right here in your ear so to make certain you understand what I'm saying. Now, why in the world would he say something like that to the near kinsman? I think this kinsman knew what had been going on in the life of Ruth and Naomi. He was the next of kin, and he had allowed his the people he was supposed to be taking care of, he probably let them go hungry, and he wasn't worried about them very much. And so now Boaz gets him in front of all the witnesses, and he says, I want to make sure you understand what it is that I'm saying. I want to pull the rags away from your ears. You know, and you can picture them there in that Middle Eastern garb, and they got that hood up over to shield themselves for the sun. He says, take your hat off now, where there's not going to be any kind of misunderstanding. I will get right up here and advertise it in your ear. Make sure you understand what's going on. And he says, you need to buy this land back. And so the man says, okay, I'll buy the land back. Look, if you would, in the text of Scripture right there in verse 4. He says, if thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. For there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee. Boaz states, if you're not going to redeem it, then I'll do it myself. And the man begins to ponder in his mind at this time, well, if I buy the land, I do accept the responsibility of taking care of Naomi. But Naomi, she is a very elderly lady. She's probably not going to last very long. So if I buy this land, then she passes off the scene. Now I've got the land, and I'm okay. And nothing has been mentioned about Ruth at this point. And so at this point, the near kinsman speaks up, old so-and-so, and he says, I'll buy. That's fine. Well, Boaz is holding his trump card. And now look what Boaz says. Boaz says, fine, you go ahead and buy it, but the redemption of the land is not enough. There's a personal relationship involved. Look in verse 5. Boaz says, not so fast. If you take the land, you have to take the woman. Then said Boaz in verse 5, what day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. In other words, not so fast, old so-and-so. You buy the land, then you're marrying the woman too. And then he throws in this, Ruth the Moabitess. Now remember, a Moabite, it's a different race, see? And they were kind of looked down on by the Israelite people. And he tells old so-and-so, you really don't want to marry Ruth, a Moabite. My goodness. What's everybody in your family going to say if you marry a Moabite woman? And just as quickly as the near kinsman says, I'll buy the land, just as quickly now he backs out and says, well, I don't mind having the land. You know, if all it meant was just taking care of Naomi in her old age, I'll outlive her and then I'll have the land. But if I marry this woman, she's young, and she's going to outlive me, and I'm going to have children by her, and her children will get the land, and it won't stay among my children. In fact, look at what he says in the text of Scripture. He says, look down if you would in verse 6. The kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. So why does he turn down Ruth? I think there's probably several reasons. Probably he didn't want to marry a Moabite. It could be that he is an elderly man, and he already has a wife, and he doesn't want another one. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Honey, I brought Ruth home tonight. Probably wouldn't go over well. It could be that he's an older man, and he doesn't want to have any more children. And if he marries Ruth, he is stating, he is promising to have children by her so that they can receive the dead husband's inheritance. He's also worried about questions of his own children's inheritance. He looks at how young Ruth is, and he says, you know, she's really young. She might have 3 or 4 or 5 children by me, and then when I die, those kids are going to fight with my kids over the inheritance. And so he just says, maybe I ought not to do this, but let me tell you the real reason why I think he turned it down. He turned Ruth down. He turned Ruth down because God's in charge of everything, and God had already ordained that Boaz was going to be the one to be in the line of Jesus. And so I think that all these feelings that the near kinsman had, I think many of those feelings, God just placed them in his heart and made him feel the way he did about Ruth, because God had already ordained in his providence that Ruth and Boaz were going to be a family together. So then at that time, Boaz signs a contract to become the Redeemer. And look, if you would, in verse 7, and you can see the unusual way they signed contracts in Bethlehem in that day. Now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing. For to confirm all things, a man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor. And this was a testimony in Israel. Therefore the kinsman said to Boaz, Buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe. And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, You are witnesses this day that I bought all that Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Maon's from the hand of Naomi. Now what's this business about the shoe? What in the world does that mean? By taking off the shoe, old so-and-so is making a statement. I am now barefoot, and I'm unable to walk on the land that I have now sold or allowed you to redeem. I hadn't got my shoe on anymore, and I can't walk on the land. And it was a symbolic thing that he did in front of the 10 witnesses. So when he took off his shoe and he gave it to Boaz, that's how they signed the contract. And so the contract was made. And then Boaz speaks up, and he makes the statement in verse 10. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Maon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren, and from the gate among his brethren, and from the gate of his place, ye are witnesses this day. And so he states, I am going to marry Ruth. And to Boaz, the most important thing is not just redeeming this land. The most important thing is marrying Ruth. And he takes the land in order to get Ruth as his wife. Now the third section. The witnesses of this redemption bless the actions of Boaz. And there is a most unusual statement that is made here. The witnesses of Boaz's redemption praise his action in verse 11. It says, all the people that were in the gate and all the elders said, we are witnesses. And then they wish 2 blessings on him. In verse 1, it says, verse 11, the Lord make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel and like Leah, which 2 did build the house of Israel, and do thou worthily in Ephratah, and be famous in Bethlehem. Now, when he gives that blessing, when the crowd gives that blessing to Boaz, I think this is what they mean. Rachel and Leah were the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so they said, may your household be like the 12 tribes of Israel. Everybody ought to have a bunch of kids to look like 12 tribes. And I think that's kind of what he's getting to. May you have a large household. May the Lord bless you in the way he blessed Rachel and Leah. But at the same time, he says, do thou worthily in Ephratah. Do you remember what family line Naomi came from when we started this? She was referred to as an Ephrathite in Bethlehem. Remember that? Part of the upper class of Bethlehem. And so the crowd comes back now, and it's kind of like, Naomi lost all that when she left Bethlehem. Well, we're going to return it to her family now. Do well in Ephratah. And he says, be famous in Bethlehem. So that blessing is kind of hard, kind of easy to understand. But then look at the second blessing. Look in verse 12. And let thy house be like the house of Pharaz, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. He says, may your house be like the household of Judah and Tamar. Now, if I had been living in that day, and someone said, let your house be like Judah and Tamar, I'd have been offended by that. And let me tell you why. You can read about it over in Genesis chapter 38. Judah had a son, and his name was E-R. That was his name, And married Tamar. And was a very evil man, and the scripture says that God slew him, killed him, because he was so evil. And so Tamar needed a husband. Remember the law of the kinsman redeemer? She was to marry Er's brother. He had a brother, his name was Onan. So she married Onan. Onan was also a very evil man, and he displeased the Lord, and God killed him. And so now here's Tamar. She's married 2 of the brothers, and both of them have died. And she comes back to the father, Judah, and she says, look, pa-in-law, father-in-law, I married your first son, he died. I married your second son, he died. Law of the kinsman redeemer, you need to provide me with a third husband. And Tamar kind of sits back and he says, you've already killed two of my sons, and I'm not so sure I want to send a third son over to your house. And so he says, you go back to your father, and you live as a widow until my next son gets old enough to marry you. And then I'll send him over to claim you as a bride. The law of the kinsman redeemer. So Tamar agrees. Well, she goes back to her father's house, and Judah conveniently forgets all about her. I'm not going to send another son over there to marry that woman. Two of her husbands have already died. I don't want to lose another son. And so Tamar is mad at Judah because Judah is not taking care of the responsibilities of his family. So this is what Tamar does. Tamar dresses up like a prostitute. And she waits for Judah, her father-in-law, to come by. And Judah, who's probably not one of the most pious individuals in the world, goes in and has a relationship with this prostitute, and he doesn't realize it's his daughter-in-law, and she gets pregnant from the relationship. Well, a few months go by, and word reaches Judah. Your daughter-in-law is pregnant. She has committed adultery. She has been a prostitute. And Judah says, we're going to kill her. We're going to put her to death. And he demands that she be brought forward. Well, she kind of did some sneaky things in bargaining with him, and she was able to prove to him that he was the father of her child. And so now the father-in-law has had an illicit relationship with his daughter-in-law. And he doesn't put her to death. He can't. She's carrying his child. He's the one who's really sinned. And she has twin boys. And one of them is named Pharez, and one of them is named Zara. Now, why in the world would they ever wish for his house to be like the house of Pharez, the seed of the illicit relationship between Judah and Tamar? I'll tell you why. Pharez is the great, 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 great grandfather of Boaz. And you'll see that if you look back over here in the text of Scripture. Look over here in Ruth 4, beginning in verse 18. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez begat Hezron. Hezron begat Ram. And it goes on down until you get to the man Boaz. He was his fourth generation great-grandfather. And here's what I think. Here's how I interpret it. He says, may your house be like the house of Tamar and Judah. Probably one of the most embarrassing situations in Boaz's life had been the fact that his great-great-great-great-grandfather had done that. And I think it's brought up before the elders of the city now because they're telling him, what you have done in being the kinsman redeemer to this Moabite woman is now going to erase that blight of Judah and Tamar off your family. And your grace that you are showing to her is going to be a recompense to pay for that horrible event. I think that's why it's mentioned. To me, that's the only reason why I can see why it would be brought up. All right, now, very quickly, I think that Boaz and Ruth, I think him doing this with her, it shows us the difference between grace and law. Boaz personifies grace. The near kinsman personifies the law. You see, Boaz, he's personal. He's going to have a personal relationship with Ruth. The near kinsman, he's not even named in the text. And that's what the law is like. See, the law is cold and it's cruel. It has no relationship whatsoever. Boaz offers himself to a Moabite. The law only offered itself to one who was perfect without any blemish whatsoever. And then I think you also got to come away with the idea that the law won't reach down to help someone who has a fault. And Ruth had faults. She was a Moabite. Grace looks beyond who you are and just loves you, period. And that's the way that Boaz was. All right, we're going to have to quit there. You want to ask a question or make a comment about anything in the book of Ruth? We're going to finish Ruth next week. Anybody want to ask a question about Ruth? Nobody has any questions tonight. You folks are hesitant to ask questions. I've noticed that about you. Should I bring some rumors of church members every Wednesday night, and that'll kind of prime the pump? What about so-and-so? Okay. All right. Anybody got a question? Yes, ma'am. Probably Boaz did not look to her as a real suitor or as a possible person to marry because she is very elderly and she would not be able to bear a child. And the major emphasis on the kinsman redeemer was not just taking care of the lady. It was raising up an offspring. And so if she was too old to bear children. In fact, if you'll remember, in the very first part of Ruth, she makes the statement, suppose I found a husband to take me, I'm too old to have a child. Talk to Strom Thurmond, that's all I got to say. Anybody else? Any more observations? Someone over here, I'm sorry. Somebody have a question? No? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Possibly. We do not know who wrote Ruth. And I think it's possible that a woman wrote Ruth because it is very obvious it's written from a woman's perspective. I think it's also possible that one of the individuals who was in the court there wrote Ruth because we have a lot of details as to what took place actually in the courtroom scene. For example, the place where he tells him, take the rags out of your ear, I want you to listen to what I have to say. That's, pretty first-person witness kind of thing. So it's possible that one of the men in the court of law wrote it. Some people think that a scribe in the court of David wrote it, and that would make sense too, and we talked about that at the beginning. Well, we really just don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You do. And I guess maybe the best thing I can say about the author of Ruth is I don't know who wrote it. Mm-hmm. Could have been a woman. Could have been a man in the court of law. Could have been a scribe in the court of David. I think that's one of those questions when we get to heaven, we're going to have to ask the Lord, who wrote the book of Ruth? And most of the books of the Bible tell us who the author is. But a lot of the books don't. Who wrote Hebrews? Well, that's what the King James Bible says in the subscript, but Hebrews itself doesn't say that. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. Some people think Paul wrote it. I think Apollos wrote Hebrews. Who was Apollos? Well, we won't get into that tonight. Anybody else? When we finish Ruth next Wednesday night, you want to study Revelation? You want to do that? All right, now, let me warn you. Okay? If we study Revelation, we're going to do it for a year or more. Will that hurt your feelings if we do it for a year? I'll give you handouts every week just like we do this. And it's really not that hard. You just do it piece by piece. It's really not. I promise you, I make you understand it. You want to do it? This means yes. Well, I tell you what, that's resounding. Who wants to study Job? I knew you'd raise your hand to say that. I just knew it. I knew it. All right, let's all stand and we'll be dismissed.